7 Reasons Why Britain Will Never Recover. This is Andrew Bailey, the man in charge of Britain's finances since March 2020. Having earned a PhD from the Faculty of History at Cambridge University, he is undoubtedly a clever man. But you don't get to be the £577,000 a year Governor of the Bank of England by deviating from orthodox, i.e., wrong, econometric modelling either. And so, with the UK facing its biggest economic crisis since the 1930s, we have to ask whether Bailey is up to the job. Because when he denied that interest rate rises were intended to cause an economic slump, he was, quite simply, lying. The whole purpose of interest rate rises is to make debt servicing so costly to households and businesses that they are forced to cut back on their non-essential spending. This, in turn, will cause companies to go out of business and workers to be laid off. Because of their faith in the Phillips curve model, which assumes a causal relationship between the rates of inflation and unemployment, the central bankers will only cease raising rates when they see a large rise in business failures and unemployment. This is because they have swallowed, and often promoted, the mythology of Paul Volcker, the chairman of the Federal Reserve Bank in the early 1980s, who raised U.S. interest rates to 20% in 1980 in an effort to bring inflation under control. In reality, it was the second oil shock, caused by the Iranian Revolution and the Iran-Iraq War, which created the recession. And just like today, central bank rate rises served only to turn a bad recession into a severe slump. In a recent paper presented to Bank of England officials, Swati Dhingra and Jack Page explained that, contrary to the economic orthodoxy, Britain is in the grip of an import-related supply shock. High levels of international and domestic production fragmentation mean that final imports for consumption substantially underestimate the role of imported inflation. Imported inflation has therefore been the dominant source of the cost of living crisis in the UK, making up over 70% of headline inflation. Domestically generated inflation, through wages and profit margins, has been relatively subdued despite the scale of the terms of trade loss experienced by the UK. In addition, evidence is growing that much of the remaining 30% of headline inflation has been the result of price gouging, as corporations report rises in profits of 50% or more. Wages, meanwhile, which Bailey and his chums keep blaming for inflation, continue to fall in real terms. In other words, interest rates can do nothing to lower prices, which are largely driven by international problems, such as broken supply chains and self-destructive sanctions. Bailey, along with several Tory ministers and journalists within the establishment media, has been keen to point out that at just 5%, interest rates are lower than they had been in 2009, and far lower than they had been in the 1980s. This, though, is misleading because, as Ed Conway recently pointed out, it overlooks changes in affordability. In 1980, the average UK house price was just £20,000. Even at a 20% interest rate, the monthly repayment was just £340. That's £1,387 adjusted for inflation. At an interest rate of 6%, you'll be lucky to find a lower rate. On a 20-year mortgage of £285,000 today, your monthly repayment is going to be £2,042. Nor does the pain end there. Because the speed at which interest rates have been raised means that businesses and households have had no time to adjust. Unlike the USA, where mortgages are fixed over 20 or 30 years, most UK mortgages are short-term, lasting just 2 or 3 years. Cast your mind back to the spring of 2020. Most people were under house arrest and forbidden to take more than an hour outdoors for exercise, one of the few exceptions being house hunting. At the same time, a large part of the salaried classes discovered that they could just as easily work from home. The result was that somewhere between 800,000 and a million new mortgages were taken out, at a time when the Bank of England rate was just 0.1%. Those mortgages are about to fall due, and when they do, close to a million mortgage payers are going to see their monthly repayments rise from around £1,000 to nearly £2,000 in a single jump. In short, a recession is now inevitable. The only question left to be answered is just how bad it is going to be. There is, though, a much bigger issue that almost everyone is ignoring. What happens after the Bank of England succeeds in torpedoing the UK economy? Because the one thing I can promise them is that what worked in the 1980s most certainly won't work today. Here are 7 reasons why. Reason 1. Inequality. In the years after the Second World War, workers' wages grew in line with GDP growth. This resulted in the transformation of Britain into a consumer-driven economy in what we think of as the post-war boom, the growth in industries like fashion, music, and tourism reflecting the newfound affluence. That all changed in 1980. While GDP growth continued, the workers' share of the proceeds remained flat, while almost all of the gains went to the already wealthy. But it wasn't only relative income and wealth which changed. In 1980, the standard of living of ordinary working people was bolstered by a raft of public services which have been systematically undermined over the decades since. The most obvious example is NHS dentistry, which had been available to all in 1980, but is almost non-existent in 2023. The same goes for bus routes across the UK, and even getting to see an NHS doctor face-to-face has become difficult. We also had a massive stock of council housing in 1980. This helped to anchor the cost of both private rented accommodation and the price of houses. It was also the first thing that the incoming Thatcher government set out to abolish. Today, people have little choice but to pay exorbitant rents or to pay over the odds to buy a house or flat of their own, so that housing costs account for an ever larger chunk of household spending. Despite lurid establishment media claims to the contrary, UK social security was never generous by comparison with our European neighbours. Nevertheless, in 1980, the old age pension was a third of the average wage, while unemployment benefit was about a quarter. As with council housing, the Thatcher government quickly set about cutting social security at the same time as introducing stricter qualifying rules. While old age pension rates have been protected, although the qualifying age has been raised, since 2008, the attack on out-of-work and disability benefits has continued unabated. The end result is that the UK class structure has changed beyond recognition. Gone are the days when trades unions organised the massed ranks of miners, dockers, steel workers, shipbuilders, and railway workers. And while Labour politicians and activists continue to wax lyrical about this now extinct working class, the majority of British people today find themselves in a growing precariat, pinballing in and out of unstable, low-paid, 0 hours, part-time, gig, and self-employed work, punctuated by periods at the mercy of the UK's punitive benefits system. What this adds up to is a UK population which lacks the means to generate the consumer-led recovery which eventually materialised in the second half of the 1980s. Too much of what remains of Britain's wealth is in the hands of a minority which is so small that it cannot possibly replace the spending that the precariat can no longer afford. And after the gathering slump, the precariat itself will be lucky to afford even the bare necessities. Reason 2. Debt. For 3 centuries prior to 1980, with the exception of the 2 world wars, the UK government had run a small budget surplus. At the same time, private debt, other than mortgages, was almost non-existent for ordinary working households, few of which even had current accounts prior to 1980. However, one of the main ways in which the UK dug itself out of the depression of the early 1980s was by massively expanding access to credit. In effect, we borrowed consumption from the future, that is, today, so as to generate growth back then. Initially, the relaxation of lending rules was needed to allow council house tenants to buy their homes. But after the 1986 Big Bang deregulation of banking and finance, purchasing big-ticket items on credit became the norm. Government, too, began to use cheaper access to foreign debt as one way of financing increasingly complex and bureaucratic public services and welfare systems. Indeed, the Blair governments used private debt to rebuild and expand public infrastructure, including new schools, universities, and hospitals. And governments since have opted for the use of debt to cover the growing holes in day-to-day spending, rather than face the electorate with the hard choices about which public spending will have to be cut. Hiding just out of sight in 2023 is an army of zombie companies and households which, until now, have been managing to service their debts, but not repay them. When their mortgages and loans have to be rolled over, and their servicing charges rise from 1.5% to more than 6%, the zombie apocalypse will kill the economy and, crucially, remove the tax base needed for government to repay its debts too. The immediate problem will be finding ways of paying off or writing off the debt we have already run up. Accessing further credit, and particularly government accessing foreign currency, at an affordable interest rate, will be extremely difficult, if not impossible. And this means that a 1980s-style debt-based recovery is out of the question. Reason 3. Manufacturing. In 1980, the UK economic base consisted of a combination of old 19th-century industries such as coal mining and steel working, together with post-war boom sectors like aviation, automobiles, petrochemicals and pharmaceuticals. In the recession of the early 1980s, millions of jobs were lost as this industrial base was culled. Indeed, one of the mainstays of the eventual recovery resulted from the offshoring of the UK's manufacturing base, so that cheap labour abroad could be used to bring down domestic prices. In the debt-based recovery, this allowed the emergence of a service economy which could be maintained through cheap imports of everything from electronic luxuries to necessities like fuel and food. In 2023, headline manufacturing data is flattering because a large part of what UK industry does today is only to assemble components imported from elsewhere in the world. As someone once cruelly explained, if you import cars, spray them with paint, and then re-export them, you are not exporting cars, you are exporting paint. And even this is at risk, because the main reason foreign companies set up their assembly plants in the UK was to have a foot inside the EU customs union. Now that Britain has left the EU, there is less incentive for new plants to be set up here. The immediate problem will be to maintain a viable core industrial base, without which recovery will be impossible. Continuing to live on no longer cheap imports is not an option for the future. Reason 4. Public assets. In 1980, the UK public owned most of the high-cost critical infrastructure for which capital formation is often impossible, but without which economies cannot function. The transport network, road and rail, was public, together with the electricity and gas grids, the telecommunications infrastructure, and unprofitable but necessary, at the time, coal mining and steel making. There were, of course, ongoing concerns with the way in which these industries were mismanaged, and examples of corruption abounded. But given the state of the same infrastructure in private hands in 2023, it is hard to argue that privatization was a solution. What privatization did do, however, was to provide an indebted UK state with a regular infusion of foreign currency whenever industries were flogged off to the highest bidder. Income from the sale of public assets grew exponentially between 1980 and 1988, and in 1992 reached a high point of £8 billion. In this way, the sale of public assets was another mainstay of the debt-based recovery. And the obvious point here is that in 2023, the cupboard is bare, and so, the privatization trick cannot be repeated. Reason 5. Population. In May 1979, Margaret Thatcher was voted into government by the first generation not to have direct experience of depression and war. Without the votes of the 18 to 35 age group, Thatcher would have lost. And it was this excess of so-called baby boomers which provided the Thatcher government with the demographic basis for a recovery. A large, youthful population provides the tax base which allows governments to borrow to fund everything from infrastructure investment to pensions and health care, with the average worker paying the most tax in their late 40s and early 50s. In 2023, the situation has reversed. There are now more old-age pensioners than there are children in the UK, and close to 4 million more pensioners than there were in 1980. Since the early 2000s, governments have attempted to bridge the growing gap via immigration. But the chaotic manner in which this has been done has left a growing skills gap unchecked, even as resentment has grown among the precariat because too many unskilled migrants have held down incomes and overloaded housing and public services. It is also worth noting that during the 2 years of state-imposed house arrests, tens of thousands of migrants left the UK, preferring to return to their families to ride out the crisis. This may well be a harbinger of what is to come when the UK economy implodes, since the whole point of economic migration is to move from stagnating to growing economies, not to remain in declining economies as they implode. While the UK may hang on to its lowest-paid migrants, it is unlikely that it will ever again attract the numbers of skilled workers it needs. And so, unlike in the 1980s, Britain cannot turn to a young population, either domestic or imported, to support a recovery in the 2020s. Reason 6. Energy. In 1980, the UK still produced millions of tons of coal to power its industry and, especially, an energy grid that was only then beginning to provide a firm, 24/7 electricity supply. And while coal was gradually being phased out, even after the 1984 to 1985 miners' strike, coal continued to provide a large part of the energy to power the UK economy. By the 2000s, UK coal production had slumped, and the UK had become dependent upon imports to make up the shortfall needed by key industries like steelmaking and cement, without which none of the alternatives for generating electricity can be built. Most important of all to the recovery in the 1980s, though, was the arrival onshore of vast quantities of oil and gas from the British sectors of the North Sea. Oil production rose from around 500,000 barrels a day in 1979 to more than 2.5 million barrels a day in 1987. The slump in production between 1988 and 1994 was the result of the Piper Alpha disaster, which also prevented the North Sea fields from peaking in the 1990s. Less obviously, that same slump resulted in the UK briefly becoming a net importer of oil and gas, as demand had risen along with supply during the recovery in the 1980s. The UK North Sea fields reached peak production in 1999, and Britain became a permanent net importer from 2005. Although the establishment media periodically hyped the few remaining untapped deposits, such as the Cambo field in the Atlantic, these tend to be too small and or too difficult to be worth investing in, something which is not helped by state net zero laws and corporate environment, social, and governance, ESG, lending rules. Nor can you extract what isn't there. Despite claims that vast shale gas deposits sit beneath northern England, many geologists have concluded that most of the gas which was there vented into the atmosphere millions of years ago. And again, if there is any gas there, it is likely to be too expensive to make recovery worthwhile. The politically preferred energy sources in 2023 are wind farms and nuclear power stations. But here, we have to take a hard look at the costs and timescales involved. Both the giant Hornsea wind farm and the Hinkley Point C nuclear power plant have taken more than a decade to construct. So far, they have cost more than £34 billion to provide a maximum of 4.4 gigawatts of electricity. And crucially, they are not even replacing the generating capacity which is being lost as coal, gas and old nuclear plants are being decommissioned. This, of course, is before we factor in a switch to electric trucks and cars, which will add demand for terawatts of additional electricity rather than the few gigawatts provided by wind and new nuclear. The bottom line is that while, in the 1980s, there was a large surplus of energy to power the recovery, in 2023 we have a growing deficit which simply cannot be replaced. Reason 7. Executive dysfunction. While any one of the problems set out so far would present a serious barrier to recovery, and while the combination of all 6 is a showstopper, perhaps our biggest problem is that we are ruled by an insular and self-destructive elite. Just as Nero fiddled while Rome burned, so our economic and cultural elite are engaged in irrelevant infighting over techno-utopian fantasy futures in which we'll all own nothing and apparently be happy about it. Meanwhile, the infrastructure on which the bright green future will supposedly be based is crumbling to dust, even as the other inputs required for future prosperity, as we have seen, are no longer available. The term executive dysfunction comes from psychiatry and describes a phenomenon in which depressed patients are unable to do things despite cognitively understanding that they must. Someone may know, for example, that they have to pay a bill or take a shower before going out, but some mental barrier prevents them from doing so. Something similar has infected the UK government, both the elected politicians and the permanent bureaucracy. In 1980, government, national and local, employed and managed millions of people across critical infrastructure and public services. Parliament was packed with elected members who had previously had to meet a wage bill or had worked on the shop floor. That is, people who knew how to get things done. Britain's senior civil servants in the 1980s had begun their careers administering the war effort, before moving on to overseeing the massive reconstruction in the decade following the war. In 1980, nobody knew what a PPE degree, politics, philosophy and economics, or a SPARD, special advisor, was. Today, former special advisors with PPE degrees are the largest group of MPs. Professional gobshites with no clue as to how to get anything done. While government employs lots of people, far more than they will be able to afford in the near future, these days, they have little experience of anything more than subcontracting. They hire expensive consultancy firms like PwC and McKinsey to tell them what to think. Then they pay expensive corporations like Capita, Virgin, and Maximus to, largely fail to, put ideas into practice. And so, faced with the worst economic crash in living memory, the government, and, indeed, the wider cultural and economic elites, are incapable of either the disruptive original thinking or the means of acting upon it, which are necessary to even begin the process of recovery. And voting for the lesser of two evils isn't going to change anything. For these 7 reasons, the country which was the first on Earth to industrialize, and which once ruled over a quarter of the planet, is said to be the first of the developed states to suffer an irreversible collapse.